You are listening to The Dish on Health IT, brought to you by Point of Care Partners, a leading health IT consultancy. Each episode will feature a rotating panel of senior consultants and guests who will talk about trends and innovations in health IT, while also highlighting how organizations can leverage these advances to solve their business problems. Today's episode focuses on some key takeaways from the recent ONC Tech Forum. Senior Health Information Technology consultants Gary Austin, Ken Kleinberg, Pooja Babbrah, and Jocelyn Keegan trade key areas of interest they took away from the sessions they attended. If you missed this year's ONC Tech Forum, we hope this discussion will make you feel like you were there, but shorter. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and that you'll share your topic ideas with us by emailing us at podcast@pocp.com.
Good day, everybody, and welcome to the ongoing adventures of The Dish on Health IT. I'm your host, Gary Austin, affectionately known as Lumpy, coming to you from the beautiful Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. We at Point of Care Partners are health IT consultants with 100-plus associates in over 35 states. Actually, I think upwards of 120 now. We've been on quite a hiring spree. We work across all stakeholder groups: payers, healthcare delivery entities, pharma, health IT vendors, and government agencies. And we're viewed as an independent, trusted party, the Switzerland of consultancy. Well, recently, ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator, CMS's innovation arm, hosted its annual Tech Forum. This year's virtual, of course, and we had a number of our Point of Care Partners subject matter experts attend virtually. So I thought we'd play a bit of inside baseball this episode on The Dish. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to put on my beloved Boston Red Sox hat. I thought we'd play some inside baseball here, and I've asked our practice leads, Jocelyn Keegan, who heads our payer practice and is the program manager for HL7 Da Vinci FHIR Accelerator, Ken Kleinberg, who heads our innovation technology practice, and Pooja Babbrah, who heads our PBM practice, to join me here today. So let's start with some opening perceptions on the conference and kind of what you heard, anything that's going on. Let's go through our lineup alphabetically. So Jocelyn, anything that sort of stood out to you about the conference that you just like, wow, we got to really follow up on that, or payers or providers or HIEs are going to need to really get on top of this sooner rather than later?
You know, I think I have a couple thoughts about the conference itself. One of the things I would say is I actually think that at the end of the day, we've all been through a litany of using all of the tools and all of the different platforms to be able to communicate. And I think that the ONC team did a great job of providing an online experience that, while, you know, nothing's going to replace us being in person, I think provided sort of the interactivity and the ability for people to sort of move across streams, and selected a vendor tool that worked really well for that. So sort of that's the program manager in my head sort of assessing, like, how do they do on mission? I think the other thing that was really interesting was, you know, FHIR was definitely the message of the day. You know, the ONC team has come off, you know, really strong from a regulatory perspective, but also just evangelizing. You know, I think that both Posnack and Dr. Rucker, you know, came out strong, were very directed in their messaging to the community about, you know, the time is now to make this work. And throughout, I think for those of us that are playing the inside baseball game, some digs to say, you know, the clock is ticking down and we are going to start, you know, coming after folks that are perceived as information blocking. And I think we've seen in the weeks since then, people starting to do things like dropping toll charges and participation fees, right, in some of the App Store activities that have been happening. So I think that they're being very effective. The other point that I would make, and I think it's sort of an undertone through a lot of the work when we think about providers and payers in this space, is really the synergy that's happened, I think, between CMS and ONC in really being well coordinated and showing a common face. So if you attended a number of these types of sessions through the month of August and now rolling into September, just the uniformity around, you know, really moving forward, moving to APIs, FHIR being the way to do that, and a steady, you know, sprint of regulations that are being not you know, there was a little bit of forgiveness given to COVID, but, you know, deadlines that are in place for both payers, providers, and the vendors that support them, you know, really in the next 6 months to, you know, year and a half. And so the march has occurred. And we're hearing, I think ONC gives us always a great forum and a great set of folks to talk about what the early adopters are doing and showing that this work is really working.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great point too. Historically, CMS and ONC haven't always sort of been in lockstep, right? Sometimes they leapfrog each other, sometimes they diverge, whatever else. It sounds like they really are sort of aligning now in terms of how they're driving the industry forward. So good stuff. Ken, how about any perceptions from your end?
I enjoy these kind of events. I see that clearly we're in a pandemic and we couldn't be face to face, but I thought they did a good job. They had a platform that we could use that lets you move between the tracks and so forth. It's simpler actually than changing physical rooms. The HIEs were given a lot of attention, and some would say that they were made for scenarios like this. I also enjoyed the session that discussed healthcare systems in other parts of the world. And we often think about that, but it hasn't always been a government focus to talk about it. And I think there's a recognition that there are certain aspects of healthcare that we do exceptionally well. We're a world leader. And then there are a lot of areas where other countries have done a lot better with this. And it could be that their healthcare is more government run or not. So I found that pretty fascinating. Areas that I listened to in particular had to do with content, that content track. And it was very concerning to hear all the challenges with labs and how results were not exchanged as effectively as we'd like to see them exchanged, and how even ordering lab tests was very confusing for the physician. So I hope I get a chance to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the podcast.
Excellent. Very good. And Pooja, your opening sort of comments.
Yeah, so I think, I'd like to zoom out a little bit, and really kind of the overall theme is that there's really this pent up consumer demand, right, for a better healthcare system. And I think the public and us as consumers are really, figuring out that there's just this huge gap that needs to be closed. And so I actually attended the track that was kind of off the beaten path, I'd like to say, because it included, those groups that are not always part of the center, right? I mean, we're always talking about the EHR vendors and the payers, but you forget there's long-term care groups out there, there's pharmacies out there, there's the imaging centers, the labs, and, this whole virtual world that we still haven't really dug into of the apps, right? And so the track that I attended was talking about the fact that, a lot of what we're doing with FHIR and the resources and US Core is great, but it's those specialty groups that often feel that whatever's being done today does not quite meet what they need. And so it was an interesting conversation around, when you're looking at what ONC and CMS is trying to do, which is essentially support value-based care, you have to be thinking about everyone in the healthcare spectrum. And so it was more of a focus on how do we now start thinking about these specialized, the pediatrics, the folks that are out there, the pharmacy folks, and bringing them kind of more into the fold as well. So I thought it was good that they had almost a whole track kind of focused on these additional stakeholders.
Yeah, really good. We talk a lot about the ecosystem in the practice here, right? And it's really sort of wiring everybody up as we go along. It's no longer sort of a payer to facility game and ambulatory sort of comes along for the ride. It's really picking off everybody else. Okay, very good.
Gary, there's one other point I think that's important to make there, though, because I think that Pooja is really getting at something important. As we move towards FHIR and we move towards APIs, the cost to be able to loop in those other stakeholders becomes significantly more accessible, right? Because of the reusability of APIs. And I think that there's an interesting theme that we heard. And again, I think it's ONC pushing hard on this, which is this idea of we're really shifting away from sort of patient by patient calls from an API perspective. And really that shift towards how are we going to use FHIR for transport at a bulk level, and really starting to see use cases and innovation in the industry. And I think to Ken's point, sort of the ability for the HIE to really be able to shine in this kind of environment, and the role of the integrators across all of these different parties as this data starts to get unleashed for, not just first use, but second, third, fourth, fifth use of that same data to all of these different stakeholders. And it's really, we're at the precipice of really being able to see the power of that in improving patient outcomes in healthcare.
Yeah, it was definitely nice to see kind of this whole focus on HIEs, right? You're definitely seeing that comeback of the HIEs and their role in all of this. So absolutely.
Got it. We're seeing more and more of this in the practice where, historically we've had, EMR vendors. Now we're starting to get sniff EMR vendors that are coming, or home health entities that are coming to talk to us, or personal devices coming to talk to us about interoperability. So we're seeing that ecosystem expand and wanting to leverage these common APIs, common ways to distribute data and things. Okay, second inning. Let's go into a laundry list of topics here and let you all opine on them. So, Jocelyn, let's start with you. How fast is FHIR's fastball?
So I think it's really amazing, because I think that there's two things that are happening. I think at ONC we heard from people that are actively using FHIR. There were instances due to COVID that we were seeing FHIR servers and specs being spun up very quickly for people to exchange data where there wasn't format to begin with. But I also think that we're seeing in the industry real live implementation guides being put into production, and really this momentum happening as people are gearing up to meet regs and ready themselves, to really ward off any risk of information blocking. We have a couple curmudgeons internally within the organization. I think that would be our FHIR skeptics. I think that what we're seeing is it's still early and it's maturing as a standard, and I know we'll dig into that a little bit later. Sort of how do we make sure it meets all the needs for all of the different transport that we need. But it's been really fantastic to watch real world examples and leadership happening. And things being ready for prime time. I think that as we've seen a softening, and I think you heard that, people sort of dealing with the immediate impact of COVID and the impacts on, for the most, more disproportionately for the provider side of the house, dealing with sort of emergent issues. But I think what we're hearing as people sort of start to bring their head back above water is more now than ever, this data that we're unleashing is critically important, and where we've tolerated it being inefficient in the past, it's now basically just been splayed out for us why it's so incredibly important, whether it's a telehealth visit, and we heard about people that ramped up their telehealth really quickly, or it's, literally I'm seeing a patient that I've never seen before that isn't part, how do I get information about this patient? To be able to make sure that that data is available has been, made blankly clear to all of us. And it was great to see people that have been on the front lines out there coming and evangelizing about how they were able to leverage FHIR to improve that.
Very good, very good. Third inning, health information exchanges, HIEs, okay? Are they becoming, major stars, or still sort of steady state utility infielders? Ken, you want to start on that one?
I think they vary considerably in their success and their size and their scope. Some HIEs have started to work with other HIEs in regions, and I think that's a very good thing. We're down to about 100 significant HIEs in the country from a few hundred not that many years ago, but the ones that are here today tend to have a bit more to them, and they've had to have some kind of sustainability to who they're working with. The providers have been key, of course, for the clinical data. The payers, it's been pretty spotty as to what kind of payer involvement there are with HIEs. And we've heard some payers say that the HIEs aren't really focused on their needs. So that's something that will likely change as we move towards accountable care. That would sure seem to point us in the right direction, that these HIEs will serve both payers and providers more equally than they have in the past.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think with the HIEs, like I said, they're making a comeback. And I think part of it's because this whole focus on this patient-centered view, right? And I think, HIEs have the opportunity to take data from all different sources, right? And bring that together in that view that you need, in that patient record, as opposed to, bits and pieces that are sitting everywhere. And I think the other thing with HIEs is, we're seeing with COVID that there's so many things, kind of groups that they could potentially be reaching outside of what you can normally reach with, your EHR, other things. And I think, having kind of that reach into, the community resources, things like that. And we're already seeing some of that today with some of those forward-thinking HIEs, right? Ken mentioned we're down to, a smaller group, but the ones that are out there are actually doing innovative things, San Diego, others, MyHIN, groups like that are actually, kind of figuring out their new role in this environment and what they can be doing. So I think that's an important aspect, for these HIEs, and kind of bringing that longitudinal patient view is what they can actually do.
The payers more engaged with these HIEs.
So what I was going to say, Gare, is I feel like the folks that have done a good job of being focused on use cases and aligning with real business problems in their particular domain, whatever their region is, are the ones, we see MyHIN there for a reason, and they've worked very closely with Michigan, right? Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. We see CRISP there. They have active payer engagement in their space, as well as their big provider organizations in the Maryland area. We see, our friends from Oklahoma, we see San Diego. I think where we get to really see where there's a use case driven approach to the way the HIE is entering the market, they're then ready as a trusted partner when these sort of situations arise, right? Whether it be a hurricane or whether it be the pandemic, they're wired into those organizations because they're solving real business problems for those orgs.
Seemed like a big lack of opportunity there by many of these HIEs not being wired into public health. Is that a fair perception?
Oh yeah. So
it's glaring.
We frequently work with the folks from public health to make sure that whatever we're building is flexible enough to be reusable. And I really hope the thing that we see coming out of this is that there's real meaningful dollars put in place so that public health is at, equal footing when we're talking about building implementation guides or things that are fit for purpose for their use cases. And it's complicated, right? Because there are so many endpoints. This isn't 50 states, right? It's municipalities, it's cities, and it's all of the places that data needs to flow and all of the many endpoints that the data can come from. It's not just the hospitals, it's also the pharmacies and the provider organizations. So I'm hoping the one thing we take out of this is that we need to seriously invest in our infrastructure for public health, and that we all win if that work actually happens.
Let's go to our stepchild. Ken, what do you got to say on that?
Well, I was just going to add, on some issues, the states, are going to do things their own way, and that's wonderful. But when it comes to a pandemic, we really need a more national approach, and we're now in, call it the third generation or third attempt at a nationwide exchange with TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. That was a key part of the ONC meeting, and it's still a few years, I think, realistically away. So we still got basically the same HIE structure that we had for a decade, and in some areas, it may have been successful, but in areas like public health, which is a national concern, it's really shown itself to be pretty inadequate. And that's why we're seeing some funding by ONC in that direction, not to mention some commercial entities that are likely going to try to step in here and do something significant.
Right. Fourth inning, you can't tell the players without a scorecard. Any movement on MPI and on National Patient Identifier or Master Patient Indexes or things like that? What happened out of the conference?
Yeah, so I think out of the conference, we saw a couple things, but I think more recently, and just this past week, I think ONC has actually held listening sessions on, Universal Patient Identifier, National Patient Identifier. We're, of course, waiting to see if Congress passes legislation to actually open up to be able to do research on all this. But I attended a session actually, and I can't remember which track it was in, but it was all about, of course, being able to identify the patient is important, but there's we get caught up, right, in this, no, we don't want an NPI. Yes, we want a universal patient identifier. And what we're not looking at is, there's ways to do this, right? Let's look outside of the healthcare industry. And there's people that are actually doing this today. For example, in the financial industry, right? I mean, I can pick up my phone today and send money to someone, and I don't, there's no UPI out there. There's no national patient identifier, right? I mean, we're using emails to send, money back and forth. And so I think that was one message. But what I thought was really interesting is people are starting to look at that kind of framework around a patient identifier as well, right? So it's, yes, of course, we have to match the patient, and at some point we're going to land on some way to do that. But you really have to be thinking about also kind of, the framework around that, the security around it, the privacy framework around that, right? And I think that was really the message that I took away from the sessions that I attended, was how do you make sure that, once you identify that patient, you're actually, securely and sharing that information with the people who it needs to be shared with. So.
Well, I think the government's gone back and forth about a national patient identifier, and it seems like it's swinging back into a more positive approach. Even if we had one, we would still have to go back and associate all the past records to that national patient identifier. So defining, let's say, 10 or a dozen data fields that we're all going to agree on need to be accurate in the health record would be a key step to mapping past records to move forward.
Well, and I find, it's funny because we just had the NCPDP work group meetings, and in that we actually approved, I think, 2 or 3 more patient identifiers, because we're seeing so many out there that the approach that NCPDP took was, we're just going to approve everything because we don't know where we're going to land, right? And in a way, you think about it, there's so many different identifiers out there. People were questioning that, but it's actually a good approach, because we don't, to your point, Ken, we don't know where we're going to land. So, approve everything, because you are going to have to go back and potentially make those changes. So
you need the breadcrumbs. I think that's a good point, Pooja.
Yeah.
Okay, 5th inning, charting your pitches. It's all about the data. Okay, what do we hear about USCDI at the ONC Forum?
So this was adding on to some work that was actually presented, I want to say earlier this spring, around the team at ONC recognizing that there need to be more frequent updates and ways for the public to be able to impact what's in USCDI. And we've had some interesting conversations as a group, as sort of like, USCDI, the set of data standards that exist in the industry, and how that relates to FHIR in US core. And I can share, the conversation at ONC was really just unrolling, hey, there's going to be a way for us to be able to evolve, there to be a active way for people to submit new ideas, and that there's a cyclicality that doesn't rely on sort of these big sort of annual, biannual updates, but there's actually a path forward. And this becomes important as the expanse of people participating in the FHIR community gets larger and other stakeholders get engaged. And so I'll use an example. In the current version of the USCDI that's been published, there's fields that are really payer-provider based. If you say the words USCDI and Steve Posnack's in front of me, he's literally going to be like, I know, Jocelyn, you want coverage to be in USCDI, because I've been harassing him for a number of months, maybe years, about it. But this gives a path. And what's important is when we think about sort of how it adjusts and how it relates to the impact of how it's used in the real world in a standard like FHIR, is there's one thing to say, I have this data that's missing. It's another thing to say, hey, it's been evolved, understood well enough, used enough to say it's mature enough to now include it and require people to use it. And so if you think about the relationship for the industry, we care that the right data is there, that's available, that's able to be used and exposed, and the tie-in to the folks that are under regulation or certification being on the hook to make sure all that USCDI data is available and can be freed, right, from their databases. But then you juxtapose that to, is the industry ready, and have we spent enough time on that data to actually make sure that we know enough about it to put the effort in to make it be included. And so I think that the fact that they're essentially, and I think this is a theme we're seeing from ONC overall, both with the regs and the coordination with CMS, is they recognize we want to be able to advance things. We don't want everything to have to fall under these big regulatory umbrellas. And we want to give headroom for the innovators to get ahead of everybody else. And so I think that the introduction of this new process to be able to expand and advance USCDI independent of the big turn of the wheel, I think is really important for those of us that are implementing out in the market, and a recognition that industry really is in the driver's seat and needs to drive here.
If I could add, there are actually two paths to getting new terminology into this common core. And one way is through ONC, and a second way is through HL7, if it wasn't confusing enough.
Got it. Great. Excellent. Okay, sixth inning, Social Determinants of Health, SDOH. Are they in the game finally, or are they still warming the bench?
I vote they're in the game and important.
I agree.
There was a great idea that I heard by Jonathan Bush at the forum. He was looking for what his next big initiative will be, and he suggested that being a source of social determinants of health data for startups who may not have the resource to go out and find that all on their own could be a way to advance the use of social determinants of health and promote innovation. I thought it was a good idea.
Great, excellent. Seventh inning, performance-enhancing drugs. What'd you guys hear about labs? Seems to be really in the news on everything out there, right? Especially around COVID and such. Any information on labs are coming out of ONC?
One of the areas that I was paying particular attention to at the Tech Forum had to do with labs and the challenges with the terminology that's used, as well as how the results are distributed. For example, physicians may be ordering what they think is a certain lab test when they're actually getting another, because the names can be so similar. In one case, if the letters were capitalized or not, it could mean a different test. And then we heard that some EHRs actually capitalize all the letters. So the doc would think he was ordering one test, and in fact, it got translated by the EHR into another. Then there were also the challenges of how do the results get distributed. There are a lot of requirements in contracts for who gets to see what when, and public health oftentimes isn't getting results for a week or even 10 days after the results are known, because the test results had to pass through so many different places. And there's filtering that's going on here, where when one system communicates to the other, if what they're transmitting doesn't exactly match up in terms of the fields, certain information gets lost. So the more hops you have to make with that test, the more chance that you're going to lose some of the fidelity of the original result. The challenges that were very sobering to hear about, especially now during this pandemic, when having basically real-time results is what we really need.
I've had three COVID tests done. The results were 2 days, 9 days, and 5 days. Explain the difference. I mean, I don't get it. I don't understand. So, okay, great session, guys. Thanks for pulling that together so quick. So let's see. Let's do a little round robin of closing comments. Okay, so we'll start with our shortstop Pooja there for the eighth inning. Things that we need to look at going forward post ONC Tech Conference.
Sure. So I will actually allude to your baseball references and, talk about those players that we really see sitting on the bench, right? They're just waiting for their chance to get in the game. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, this is kind of everyone outside of the main groups of the payers and the EHRs, right? The long-term care facilities, the pharmacies, specialty providers. We're talking about labs now. We're talking about social determinants of health. And I think we're starting to see those being highlighted, right, as groups that need to be brought into the game, right? And we need to pay attention to them. And if we don't put money towards them, if we don't put a focus there, what we're trying to achieve out of all of this is not going to work in the end, because those are groups that need to be brought into the fold. And, they could end up being the pinch hitters in many situations. So yeah, I mean, I would just argue for the short guys that aren't always in the game.
Got it. Pooja, promoted to the starting lineup for the Diamonds.
Yes.
Congratulations. Congratulations. I mean, that's not a big leap, but good for you. So, Ken.
You know, they say that you can win games just hitting a bunch of singles, but we're far enough behind here that we need some longer balls hit. Whether we view the CMS ONC rules that came out this year as a double or maybe a triple, I don't think it's quite a home run or a grand slam yet, because we're yet to see how it's implemented, what type of enforcement there is. But putting some big runners on base here was very important, and I hope we're going to win this game, because literally so much is on the line.
Well done. Well done. You'll be on the mountain tomorrow night for your beloved Mets. Okay. Jocelyn, we go into extra innings with you. Take us out here.
So I think that what we get out of, and I think this is the 14th or 15th session that ONC has done here of, the different various formats, is I think we see the culmination of all of this work really over the last 5 or 6 years, producing itself in meaningful ways, and getting to hear from people in the market that are actively doing this work and that are on the front lines and are doing that emergent work, right? To take the tools at hand. We saw direct being used. We saw CCDA being used. I think as we think about as an industry, what are the tools that are available to get us to where we need to be today, right? To deal with the challenges that we heard Ken and Pooja describing, and that we look and we put our investments, right, in our young players that are gonna pay out for us 2-3 years from now, right? And that moving towards APIs, making things more accessible, focusing on workflow. I think it's going to be incredibly important that we're doing both those things as an industry. I think Ken's point around being able to have that global conversation, that little bromance conversation that Don was able to have with his colleagues internationally to show, fundamentally, we have challenges that are unique because of the economic political landscape and how we've designed healthcare in the U.S. But there are plenty of opportunities for us to continue to lead around things like our moves to APIs and FHIR and clinical data exchange in a meaningful way that are a requirement because of the complexity of our healthcare system. And we've put the tools out there. Now we need people to pick them up and start making hits.
Well, now with Johnny Damon long gone from the Sox, I think tomorrow night you're in center field. So,
dear Lord.
Great to hear. So, well, that's our time for this baseball edition of the Dish on Health IT. Many thanks to my roundtable guests. I appreciate it. They spent 3 days, hard days, listening to a lot of topics across a lot of different speakers, and to kind of summarize that up and pull it together here was really thoughtful of them. So big high five at the plate after their home run. We'll be back in a bit with our next edition, probably without Ken. And please subscribe to us on whatever podcast carrier you use, Apple, Google, or whatnot, okay? If you have any speaker thoughts, okay, we're lining up some speakers for the fourth quarter here. We'd love to hear some good speakers. If you have any comments or suggestions on the podcast itself, no dishes on the Boston Red Sox, of course, please email us at podcast@pocp.com. Goodbye for now, and remember, Health IT is a dish, best served hot. Good day, everyone.
Thank you for listening. If your organization needs help understanding the industry changes around medication management or how price transparency regulations may impact you, contact us at info@pocp.com.